This is Newsroom. Hello and welcome from Johannesburg here in South Africa. I'm Evan Jansen. The show, of course, always live and broadcast from our studios here in Auckland Park. Don't forget, we are live on YouTube right now with the whole show always available on demand on our YouTube channel. Today, we look at continued protests over a shortage of teachers in the Eastern Cape as schools in the northern areas there remain closed. Our question today, why do so many protests in South Africa turn violent? At SABC Newsroom is where you can interact with us. Then we look at education in conflict zones with our focus today on the Central African Republic. Johannesburg finally has cycle lanes, but cars are now using it as parking space. We close with a look at ID fraud that costs South Africa R1 billion a year and opportunities for young engineers on the African continent. But first, let's get today's news from Menindo Mal.
Good morning, I'm Menindo Mal. Let's take a look at the stories making headlines today. The Chamber of Mines has cancelled the bilateral meeting with Mine Workers Union ANCU that was scheduled to take place today. This as the National Union of Mine Workers says it signed a 2-year wage agreement with one of the gold producers, Village Main Reef. In terms of the agreement, underground mine workers will get a 1,000 Rand increase a month. Meetings with Solidarity and WASA have also been cancelled. The Chamber has instead called for a full plenary session on Thursday. Employers will table a final take or leave offer to all the unions. In the Eastern Cape, schools in the northern area of Port Elizabeth will remain closed. Education MEC Mandla Makula is expected to visit PE today. This to try and resolve a teacher shortage impasse in the area. The visit comes after violent protests involving parents and pupils following claims that several schools might be closed. A report by the department accuses some schools in the area of failing to submit employment documents for 122 available posts. The situation in Dubai and Soweto remains tense this morning following violent protests last night. Police had to fire tear gas and rubber bullets to disperse the residents who had vandalized 2 businesses in the area. The residents had again taken to streets to protest against electricity cutoffs. Meanwhile, it's been reported that 1 person has been shot dead in Tembisa on the East Rand this morning. The shooting has been linked to taxi violence. Murder-accused Christopher Panayiotou will know today if he will have to remain behind bars or not. He was denied bail by the Port Elizabeth Magistrates Court and appealed to the High Court in Grahamstown. Panayiotou is accused of masterminding the death of his wife Jade in April. The ANC wants government to urgently attend to apparent crisis in state-owned enterprises. The passenger rail agency axed its CEO Lucky Montana, while its former chief engineer Daniel Mtukulu resigned following an investigation into his qualifications. SAA Airways Chief Strategy Officer Barry Parsons resigned last week, and Eskom is battling to keep the lights on with huge delays at the building of 2 coal-fired power stations. And today, Barack Obama will be the first ever sitting US president to address the African Union. Obama is currently in Ethiopia as part of a short tour to Africa that has seen him focus on security and human rights. Earlier this week, the US president concluded his visit of Kenya, calling upon Africa's leadership to shun corruption and embrace equality. Oh, remember, you can find all of those stories on our Newsroom Facebook page. Just search for SABC Newsroom. You can also follow us on Twitter at SABC Newsroom. Evan, over to you.
Thank you, Neil. Now, relative calm has returned to the northern areas of Port Elizabeth after yesterday's running battles between police and residents over the shortage of teachers in local schools there. What was meant to be a peaceful protest quickly degenerated into violence, with protesters pelting police vehicles with stones and police in turn firing rubber bullets. 3 people were arrested and another 3 suffered minor injuries during the protest. Now, our reporter Iviwe Poti went out this morning to check on the situation. She's back at the office in studio, joins us live from Port Elizabeth. Very good morning to you, Iviwe. Thanks for joining us.
Morning, Eben.
Iviwe, just give us a quick wrap of what you saw on the streets in the northern areas this morning.
In the northern areas this morning, the situation remains calm. It is a bit tense, and drivers have been advised, just to be careful, as they're not really sure if they do have the situation under control. But it's quiet. There aren't any protests. There aren't any people on the corners, as we saw yesterday, or people trying to close off the roads. The roads are still a bit dirty from yesterday, but the main road, Strandfontein, is open, and all the roads leaving and coming into the northern areas. There are a few police that we see on the road, as well as traffic office officials. And we did see a Nyala this morning that was there, just trying to monitor the situation. That was between 5:30 this morning and 6 o'clock. But otherwise, since then until now, it's relatively quiet. People have been able to make their way to work, as well as pupils that don't study within the northern areas, the schools that are based in the northern areas. They've also been able to go to work. We've seen cars come in and out. So it's quiet now, and the police do have the situation under control.
If you understand that stakeholders are having some meetings today to try and diffuse the situation, is this part of the reason why people have suspended the protest for now?
Yes, I think, Eben, it starts with the meeting that was held last night at 6 o'clock by the Northern Areas Education Forum. They came out to speak to the community members, SGBs, as well as parents, just to, try and reiterate that violence is really not what they're looking to do. They're not looking to have a violent protest. They're just looking to highlight their issues with the Department of Education, in terms of quality education and teacher shortages. So the meeting today is at 2 o'clock between the District Education Department, as well as the MEC, who will come down from the Bisho office. He's here to speak to the SGBs and parents in terms of trying to find resolutions to the grievances that they have in a fast manner. As the Department of Education, they just want the schools to be reopened again, because you'll remember that since the beginning of third term, which is last week, children within the northern areas haven't been able to go to school. And within the northern areas itself, there are about over 50 schools that have been closed now, and so there's no education at all, talking about junior school and high school. So the main concern right now are the matrics that are supposed to be preparing for the trial examinations that come up in September.
If you were for those that see this for the first time now, can you just give a little bit of the sort of historical context of the unhappiness?
I think the unhappiness within Port Elizabeth, not just focusing on northern areas and teacher shortage, stems from a long time ago, Eben. It's been quite a few years now. But I think mainly the protests and closure of schools started last year. I think it was late last year when the northern areas actually closed their schools, and some of the schools in the townships as well did close some of their schools. And the Department of Education did come forward to say, the problem of teacher shortages also stems from the movement of teachers, the redeployment of teachers, and how teachers don't want to be too far from home, as well as the closure of teacher colleges, so the lack of teachers that they have to put back into the system. But they do have a bursary fund that they have now, trying to create and have more teachers that will be fed back into the system. But when we look specifically at the northern areas, it's not only about the movement of teachers, as well as teacher shortages and teachers that are groomed at university level or teacher colleges, but it's that they lack teachers that can teach in Afrikaans, as the northern areas are mainly based, Afrikaans schools. So there's a lack of teachers that can be able to teach Afrikaans and teach in Afrikaans. So they're trying to really, really meet each other halfway. In fact, last year, the MEC and the Deputy Minister of Education came down to say, if these schools can identify teachers that have been helping them voluntarily, they are willing to employ them, just to try and cut down the number of teacher shortages, as well as to decrease, the overcrowding within classes, because sometimes you find there are about 60 to 100 pupils in one classroom, and that is not a conducive learning environment. So the department is trying. I remember that I think they gave over about 122 positions that had to be filled within Port Elizabeth itself. And now the department has said, last week they had a report that they gave back. This was the district department, reporting back that only 55 schools within Port Elizabeth actually gave out documents that stated how many teachers they actually needed. Sometimes 2 per school, where sometimes they find that this is not really the situation, but it's up to the school to come out and actually give them the proper information so that they can try and meet them halfway.
Iviwe, thank you very much for that update. They're coming to you live from our studios in Port Elizabeth. Relative calm, she says, has returned to the northern areas there. Of course, meetings are going to be ongoing today. This after a protest over, well, a lack of teachers turned violent there yesterday. Now, elsewhere, the situation in Dube and Soweto remains tense this morning following violent protests there last night. The angry residents have apparently been protesting over what they call basic service delivery in the area. Here are some of the views, some of your views. Reza says public violence, Dube Hospital, KFC, PEP and bakery stones. Shots fired in Glovu, Mahalefe Road, unsafe, unstable. SAPS pops on scene, avoid, he says. Emily Cork says, the JMPD says residents of the Dube Hostel in Soweto are protesting and blocking roads, apparently over electricity. Razor talks about Soweto at Dube almost had a big clash between hostel dwellers and Dube residents. Looting at KFC was done again. Well, that kind of puts it in context, doesn't it? Kumuzile says, electricity protests at Dube Hospital. They've just vandalized Butterfield's Bakery and the KFC. Go yummy. Don't go near Dube Hospital. Dube Maponya is a no-go area. Why must they always loot the KFC and the... Anyhow, today's pick of the day comes from Aldrin Sampier on yesterday's Port Elizabeth school protest, captioned, Brown Fisher School, kids locked out as the parents protest. Hashtag SABC News, of course. Well, yes, that kind of puts it in context. Who are the ones that are suffering? They are the kids that are once again out of school. Now, the tweet, well, it comes from Nikki Hartle. She's saying, pity that the kids are in a protest, being exposed to violence and not in a classroom where they deserve to be. Hashtag school protests. Yes, Nikki, that is a legitimate concern. It is also that these protests are over a shortage of teachers. Well, Port Elizabeth, the Eastern Cape, very much in the news today. The Panayiotou case continues there with the bail application of Christopher Panayiotou, who's back on the court roll in Grahamstown's High Court this morning. Last week, Judge Glenn Goosen heard the bail application appeal, but reserved his judgment until today. Now, Christopher Panayiotou has been behind bars for 3 months since his arrest in April this year for allegedly masterminding the murder of his wife, Jade. Janine Lee joins us live from Port Elizabeth. Very good morning to you, Janine. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning to you, Evan.
You guys are very busy in PE. Huh? There's a lot going on down in the Eastern Cape today. Tell me quickly about the Panayiotou bail verdict today. What's the expectation?
You know, Evan, it's quite amazing if you think you and I have been talking for 3 months and we still haven't concluded a bail application. That's where we are, and this case hasn't even gone to trial yet. So I think we're in for the long run. But what's going to happen today, you will remember that last week the bail appeal was heard in the Grahamstown High Court by Judge Glenn Goosen. That took most of the day last week, and then Judge Goosen reserved his judgment until today. So what's going to happen today at 9:30? Judge Goosen is not himself going to deliver judgment. The duty judge or a duty legal official will give the judgment. He's going to possibly, he or her will read out the last paragraph of the judgment to say whether the appeal for bail has been successful or not. And the rest of the reasons that Judge Goosen stated, those will be available on paper, so we will get all those reasons. But I think it's going to be quick in and out to court, and just the last paragraph, whether the bail appeal has been successful. And we know that Christopher Panayiotu's defence team will not be travelling to Grahamstown for that. They've appointed somebody, a legal representative in Grahamstown, to receive that news, whether the bail appeal has been successful. And we know that the state, they are travelling to Grahamstown for that. And the talk in the corridors, but you can't always believe it, is that they're not thinking that the bail appeal is going to be successful, but we'll only know in an hour or so's time.
You mentioned the long haul a little bit earlier. I see that Chris Panayiotou has strengthened his legal team as well. Is it because the bail hearing or the verdict's being heard in Grahamstown, or is he strengthening because he thinks that it's going to be a long, drawn-out trial?
No, Eben, I think the strengthening of his legal team, he brought in Advocate Mark Helens, who is one of the top advocates in South Africa, just for the bail appeal in Grahamstown. And we've heard that his parents obviously are very concerned that he's been incarcerated now for 3 months, and they really wanted this bail appeal to be successful. So they brought him in, but just from the public standpoint and from the gallery standpoint, not quite sure why. Not that I can say Advocate Mark Helens seemed unprepared, but he wasn't that familiar with the case, and during the application, many times he had to confer with Advocate Terry Price on certain points. So it wasn't a slick, smooth sort of application from the defence's part, but we know that his parents wanted, a big heavyweight to deal with the bail application appeal.
You mentioned the families. How are the families holding up? I read in the papers there was an altercation last week. I read that the one family is accusing the other one of not caring and all these sorts of things. It's a bit soap opera-like at the moment, isn't it?
It is, Eben, and it's very sad. I mean, these are two families that lived closely with one another for the better part of 10 years, and they were the best of friends. They loved each other. They loved each other's children. And now they're separated and divided by what has gone down 3 months ago, the murder of Jade Panayotu, and now they are calling her Jade Ings, her maiden name. Both families were in court. They were sitting in the front row, basically one side to each side, shoulder to shoulder in the middle. And there was that altercation that you mentioned between Jade's father, Derek, and Advocate Terry Price for the defense. Jade's father was it was in court recess, Jade's father was trying to pass, and court is very full, and he held Terry Price by the back and just tried to pass behind him, and Terry Price took offense to this and reacted relatively aggressively towards Jade's father. So there was big talk about that altercation, but just sad, even that it's come down to two families that are not talking to each other at all.
And then what are the people in Port Elizabeth saying now? It's 3 months later. There were protests. The like. Is it still that high profile?
Yeah, still high profile. Still out there. The Justice for Jade campaign is up and running. Started by her sister Tony. It's all over social media. There's a run coming up in Port Elizabeth, a Justice for Jade run. So it's very much alive and well. And yeah, but I mean, each court appearance, there's protests outside court, there's women's groups that are in court. As I said, I've said it many times to you when we've spoken, this is not something that's going to go away, and I think that the trial, when it goes to the High Court next year, is going to be followed very, very, very closely. And I think it probably all goes back to the Oscar Pistorius trial. A precedent was set about how interested the public actually are, and I think it's actually filtered down to Port Elizabeth, and all eyes will be on the city when this goes to trial.
Janine, thank you very much for that update. Of course, Janine and our team in Port Elizabeth will keep us updated on this very interesting story, interesting case. Of course, the verdict on that bail application will be heard, or the bail appeal will be heard today, and we'll have the outcome for you on this very channel a little bit later, courtesy of Janine and the team there in Port Elizabeth. Now, let's take a look at front pages from around the globe. We start in China. The South China Morning Post reports that a Chinese security official working at the country's embassy in Somalia was killed during a bomb attack in Mogadishu on Sunday. In the United Kingdom, the Independent and Yemen's Houthi group carried on fighting across Yemen yesterday despite a ceasefire announcement led by its Saudi-led forces. And finally, in the USA, the USA Today reports that President Obama and Ethiopian Prime Minister Haile Mariam Desalegn addressed terrorism, human rights and regional security issues, including the crisis in neighboring South Sudan, ahead of their meeting with the African Union. Time for a quick roundup as to what's happening here in South Africa. We start in the capital, Pretoria, where the trial of 9 policemen accused of killing Mozambican taxi driver and immigrant Mido Masia after dragging him behind a police van in Davidson 2 years ago now is expected to resume today. Then in Port Elizabeth, as we just mentioned, murder accused Christopher Panayotu will find out today if his appeal against his bail denial was successful. He was denied bail by the Port Elizabeth Magistrates Court and appealed to the higher court in Grahamstown. Then down south in Cape Town, the sentencing proceedings in the trial of 9 men accused of dumping feces at the Cape Town International Airport are expected to continue. In February, the group was found guilty of contravening the Civil Aviation Act in the Bellville regional court, that is. Time for us to take a break. You're watching Newsroom here on SABC News.
When bees and wasps sting a person, they inject a bitterness venom in their skins.
We have about 3 spider species in South Africa that we have to worry about. Button spiders, which include, the black widow spiders, your sac spiders, and your violent spiders.
That venom is in your system, it's in your muscle tissue. And the more your heart beats, the faster your heart beats, the faster the blood is going to circulate, and consequently it's going to get that venom into your system faster.
If you see a snake like this, the best thing to do is to just stay away from it and contact somebody that specializes in removing venomous snakes.
Join me on Health Talk every Saturday morning between 9 a.m. and 10 a.m. as we unpack current health stories.
Welcome back. Now, in the Central African Republic, a crisis of violence and instability has left more than 500,000 people displaced and caused 2/3 of schools in that country to close. But the United Nations Children's Fund has set up temporary learning spaces and are helping children to continue their education. So far, 144 temporary learning spaces have been set up across the country. But many families still fear moving back to their neighborhoods, raising a lot of concern about the future of their children. Now, joining us via Skype from the city of Banjul in the Gambia. Banjul in Gambia is UNICEF in the Central African Republic's Chief of Education, Celeste Staley. A very good morning to you, Celeste. Are you there? Good morning, Celeste. Are you with me?
Yeah, good morning. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Celeste, just tell us quickly, although the unrest in the Central African Republic has calmed now, 500,000 people have been displaced, leaving many children without education. Tell us about some of the temporary learning spaces that's been set up.
Okay, thank you for having me on your program this morning.
Well, unfortunately, we've lost Celeste there. We'll try and get back to it. It's a very interesting story about education within crisis zones. It's not just about what's happening in the Central African Republic. We have many conflict zones throughout the continent, and often the first thing that suffers is education. And we're trying to look at how countries in conflict zones are overcoming these concerns. But let's take a look at, PRASA yesterday confirmed that its head of engineering services, Daniel Mtumkulu, has resigned. Mtumkulu was facing disciplinary steps relating to gross dishonesty and fraudulently misrepresenting his academic qualifications. Here are some of your views as to, as to this issue on social media. Of course, at SABC Newsroom is where you can send us your contributions. But these are some of the tweets with regards to the crisis around PRASA. Mr. Kabela says, so like Lucky Montana says, Mtumkulu has done a good job despite not having qualifications. Same thing was said about Palo. Yeah, we can be very harsh on social media, can't we? Mulalo Rashaka says, too little too late for Daniel Mtumkulu to resign. Time to resign is now. If you faked your qualifications before you catch you. No, he hasn't faked his qualifications, Mutalo. Let's understand that. He's not registered with the official board here in South Africa. He is qualified. Kati says, if you manage to sneak into the system and later claim to have qualifications, your credit will not be questioned. It's common practice. Yes, it's about this is a case about having to be registered with that council. Sisi Mata says, did he just lie or did he forge his qualifications? I mean, don't they do background checks in public service? Yeah, that is a legitimate question that's being asked. But no, he didn't forge his qualifications. He's simply not registered with a council here in South Africa. Time for us now to take a quick look at what is happening on our Newsroom Facebook page today. The ANC says it is unpatriotic of private companies to simply cut jobs, and it will further contribute to the rate of unemployment. Then, US President Barack Obama is continuing with Ethiopian talks with Ethiopian leaders, where he again raised the issue of human rights, saying more political freedom will strengthen the African nation. Then, Turkey and the United States are working on plans to provide air cover for Syrian rebels and jointly sweep Islamic State fighters from a strip of land along the Turkish border, bolstering the NATO members' security and possibly providing a safe haven for civilians. Of course, don't forget all of those you get on our Facebook page in the space bar, your search bar rather, you put SABC Newsroom, we will pop up. Now, cycling safety has become a major concern here in South Africa, as each and every year hundreds of cyclists continue to die on our roads. Government has introduced a number of safety measures, such as bicycle lanes, to ensure the safety of both our cyclists as well as motorists. But cycling lanes in and around the city of Johannesburg have now become, well, parking spots for motorists and serve as a drop-off and pick-up zone for speeding taxis. Earlier this month, a minibus taxi driver found guilty of knocking down South African Olympic cyclist Barry Stander, killed him, was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Now, joining us in studio is Jeff Bickford of the Johannesburg Urban Cycling Association. He's a board member there. We were supposed to be joined today by the Gauteng MEC for Roads and Transport, Dr. Ismail Vadi, but unfortunately he was a last-minute withdrawal today. Now, morning, Jeff.
Morning, Evan.
A mouthful there. Have you seen the pictures? I want to show you the pictures and get your reaction because, you know, at great expense, we've seen the cycling lanes being built in and around in Johannesburg. Can we have a look at some of the pictures? There we have this. This is my personal favorite. This is outside a national key point. That's the SABC. You see wonderful cycling lanes, even painted beautifully green. They've got knobs put on. We've got, of course, all these cars parked in the cycling lanes, and it's blocked off totally. And then we have a Mercedes-Benz here. Some are parked the wrong way in front of a national key point. Now, my question to you is, how do we overcome this?
So this isn't a phenomenon that is only being faced by South African cities and Johannesburg. It's faced all around the world, where there's a tendency for people who drive to not necessarily respect the infrastructure that's been provided for cyclists. And it is a question of mutual respect. It's a question of regulation, and it's a question of enforcement. But in a context where your capacity to enforce is limited, you have to be honest about that and potentially design the infrastructure to accommodate a level of limited capacity to enforce. So what you see some countries doing is, and some cities doing, is investing in cycle infrastructure that really protects cyclists. So the rumble strip would be a larger infrastructure barrier for vehicles which wouldn't be able to then move so easily into the lane.
But now we've got this. This is what we have, and I suppose we've got to play the cards that we dealt. You talk about enforcement, but I see zero enforcement. Is it a question of there's a lack of communication between, call it the Transport Department and JMPD, or there's no communication going on? How do you enforce this? I was told more than a month ago that these cars will be impounded. If you're seen to be parked on any of these spots, will be impounded. I've still to see any cars being impounded. How do we get to the enforcement bit?
Yeah, at JUCA, it's something that we've been raising quite a lot with the city. In the face of it, when you look at cycle lanes, sometimes you'll even find metro police cars, vans parked in cycle lanes, and those are the people who are supposed to be directly enforcing those lanes. So there's a massive contradiction there, and I think you touched on it, that sometimes there's a discrepancy in understanding between the Transport Department and the Metro Police and where their priority areas really are. And it is one of those things, I think, which takes time, and it is a shift, and it is a market shift from the way that we usually enforce and we usually design and build our road infrastructure. So it will take time, and the city has made some good strides, but at JUCA we're hoping that a little bit more can be done.
You talk about that more that needs to be done. What about awareness campaigns? I know this is playing the long game, But we have to, at some point, start awareness campaigns. We have to communicate with the public, and we have to get them to understand that they need to be compliant with this if we're going to build this city that moves itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we're beginning to learn now is that and it's something that a lot of cities around the world have learned, that it's not just about infrastructure. There's a whole suite of things that need to happen. It's about infrastructure, it's about awareness campaigns, it's about enforcement, it's about all of these things which come together to create a truly cycle-friendly city. And yes, while we've made the starting steps towards this journey, there's a long, hard road to go, and there's a lot more work to be done.
I ride bicycle in this city, and I find it to be a very dangerous place to ride bicycle because of the attitude of motorists towards cyclists in general. Why is that, and how do we change that?
Well, it's quite an interesting phenomenon that we have in South African cities, because we have this very large recreational cycling culture. So one of the things that around the world are known as really advanced cyclists will cycle without infrastructure. And as you say, they can navigate the dangerous streetscape. But it's about attracting people who aren't necessarily avid advanced cyclists. And what it's really about is taking that avid recreational cycling culture where people know how to cycle and they're advanced cyclists, and blending it into a culture of commuter cycling and moving through the city on your bike at all times, and not just for recreational purposes.
Well, Jeff, it is going to be a very long process, I think, that we've got ahead of us. Fortunately, the powers that be are on side that we have to change the way we move around our city. It's got to be a little bit less intrusive. Thanks for joining us today. Hopefully within the next week or so we'll be able to get Ishmael Vardy in to tell us about the enforcement scenarios and how do we police it, and the communication processes that we need in order to change this kind of behavior. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Now, of course, a little bit earlier, our Skype connection fell down in the Central African Republic. Of course, we were talking about the crisis of violence and instability has left 500,000 people displaced, causing, well, more than 60% of schools there to close. Now, I was joined a little bit earlier by Celeste Staley, who is UNICEF's Central African Republic's Chief of Education. Welcome back, Celeste. Have we stabilized the line?
Yeah, I hope so. Thank you.
So let's just give us your view as to education in conflict, especially in the Central African Republic. How tough are you finding it, and how are you overcoming the problems?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and UNICEF is providing temporary learning spaces. As I noted earlier, these temporary spaces provide a safe and protective environment for children to come every day to get classes based on the national curriculum. In Central African Republic, we've worked very closely with the Ministry of Education to ensure that the content will enable the children to return to school once the crisis is over. As you noted, the security situation is improving throughout the country, especially in the capital, but there are still pockets of insecurity. There are still areas where violence continues. And in these areas, UNICEF continues to provide education for children in these temporary learning structures.
What about teachers? How do you overcome the problems of a shortage of teachers in these areas?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a very good question as well. UNICEF, when we set up the temporary structures in these areas that are affected by the crisis, we work very closely with the community. The community helps us to select the teachers, which often come from the community themselves. So we're working with teachers who may themselves be displaced, and they offer their services in these temporary structures. UNICEF, with the Ministry of Education, provides a basic training before the classes commence, and this includes both training in academic content and skills, teacher skills, but also in important areas such as psychosocial support for children who have been affected, also in basic health, prevention of illness and hygiene. So it's a comprehensive training for the teachers as they commence to provide the instruction in these temporary structures. But if I may, in Central African Republic, even before the crisis, there was a shortage of qualified teachers. So in many areas throughout the country, you will find parents of students who are committed to provide education for their children, who work in the schools as teachers. They have basic education. They don't have qualification as teachers per se, but they provide a critical service in providing education for their children. UNICEF and the Ministry of Education recognize these teachers, and we are working to provide a basic training for teachers who provide in some areas up to 80 to 90% of the teaching force. So they're a very important part of the makeup of teachers. In addition, UNICEF will be working with the ministry to provide training and to add to the pool of qualified teachers. So we will hoping to increase the number of qualified teachers in the coming years as the crisis hopefully subsides and security returns.
Celeste, unfortunately we have to go because the line is just not good enough for our viewers to make out 100% what we are talking about. That is Celeste Staley, who came to us from Banjul in the Gambia, and of course she's the Chief of Education in the Central African Republic. We're talking about education within conflict zones and how these nations are overcoming the issues of educating young people when there's no infrastructure. Let's take a quick break. You're watching Newsroom here on SABC News.
One of the qualities I found in him is that he took his business as serious as I took mine.
When I see Kujo, I don't see disability. I see one of my boys. I work with him on any project because I believe in his input.
Diagnosed with osteogenesis imperfecta, commonly known as brittle bone disease, from a young age, Kujo knew that his winning ticket in life would be a positive mindset.
You'd work and the salary wasn't that good. That's when I saw that, let me start my own thing.
I come up with ideas, and Kujo will put those ideas into marketing tools that I can use.
Join me, Refiwe Muiba, on Bopelong, your show about those who take on and conquer life's challenges, every Saturday at 17:30.
Welcome back. You're watching Newsroom on SABC News. Let's take a look at the stories making headlines today. The Chamber of Mines has cancelled the bilateral meeting with Mine Workers Union ANCU that was scheduled to take place today. This as the National Union of Mine Workers says it signed a 2-year wage agreement with one of the gold producers, Village Main Reef. In terms of the agreement, underground mine workers will get a 1,000 Rand increase a month. The Chamber has now called for a full plenary session on Thursday. In the Eastern Cape, schools in the northern area of Port Elizabeth will remain closed. Education NBC Mandla Mokupula is expected to visit the area to try and resolve a teacher shortage impasse. The visit comes after violent protests involving parents and pupils. And the situation in Dube and Soweto remains tense this morning following violent protests last night. Residents took to the streets to protest against electricity cutoffs. Meanwhile, it's been reported that one person has been shot dead in Tembisa on the East Rand this morning. The shooting has been linked to taxi violence. Well, remember, you can find all of those stories on our Newsroom Facebook page. Just search for SABC Newsroom. You can also follow us on Twitter at SABC Newsroom. Evan, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anina. Identity theft is costing South Africa a small fortune, and the scale of the problem is well on the increase, says the research organisation Clear Data. Last year alone, ID theft contributed to the loss of R1 billion from local companies. The South African Fraud Prevention Association found that there were 3,600 cases of identity theft in 2014 and predicts an increase of, well, up to the 4,000 mark by the end of this year. Identity fraud can take place whether the victim is deceased or alive. Now, the South African Fraud Prevention Service, we are joined today by the Operations Manager, Roy Retief. Good morning, Roy. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, Eben. Thanks for having me.
Roy, we saw this story in the last couple of weeks. Of course, when you put a number up like R1 billion, suddenly everyone sits up and take notice. Before we get to the numbers game, what is identity fraud or theft, and what is the extent? We see the numbers, but what's the extent of it in South Africa, and what should people be aware of?
Yeah, but essentially identity theft is where a criminal would assume an identity of a third party. It could be an individual, it could even be an organization or a company. I think for the sake of this discussion, let's focus on the individual. So, for example, they would take on a person's identity. So Roy takes on Eben's identity, and I go and apply for example, a loan at a bank using your particulars, and fraudulently obtain that loan, spend the money, and then, in a nutshell, you are the person who the bank goes after to get the money back.
What are some of the interesting cases that you guys have come across where I see you can even take a deceased identity and do that, I suppose. But what are some of the interesting cases that you guys have come across?
Yeah, but it's really happening in the financial services industry. We've seen people taking on very, very big loans on behalf of or using other people's identities, and those people suddenly getting a terrible credit record because they haven't paid back a huge loan. We've had instances where clients or individuals have found out they've got cell phone contracts with almost every single network provider in the country that they didn't know of, with bills going up to 20,000, 30,000 Rand a month, that the organizations come to them for and say, listen, you owe us this money.
Now, the billion Rand is a number that's been branding about, and of course that's the thing that makes people sit up and take note. But how do you guys come up to the number that's $1 billion, or could it even be more than that?
Even from our side, we didn't coin the phrase the $1 billion. It was another organisation that came up, but we certainly support that amount.
Yeah.
If you look at it, typically, in a case of identity theft, let's say, for example, a fraudster opens an account with a bank in your name, you find out about it, you go to the bank and you say, look, it's not me, Eben, the genuine person who's made this loan. It's not reasonable for the bank to expect you to pay that money back, so they would typically write off that amount of money. So collectively, if you look at all the transactions that are started out using fraudulent identities, that is, I'd say, a fairly accurate figure that business in South Africa is writing off due to losses attributable to identity theft.
You mentioned that the banks will write it off once they find out, but of course there's a process that the individual has to follow to get to that point.
Certainly.
What if it happens to me tomorrow, if I discover this kind of thing, what's the immediate processes that I should engage in?
Well, firstly, what you'd need to do is you would have to approach the supplier of the good or service, and identify yourself and prove to them that this is the genuine Eben Jansen.
Yeah.
Typically, you'd go and get get an affidavit from the police. You'd also open a case of identity theft with the South African Police Service, and then approach the organisation, who would then do their investigation, bearing in mind on the documentation that they received up front when the fraudster presented the documents, and then obviously yours that you are presenting. So they would do an investigation, and with certainly our member organizations, if it's proved that you are the innocent party, they will list you as a victim of impersonation on our database, and we will then go and protect your identity, so in the form of a protective registration, so that if you had to go and apply for a product or service at another service provider that's a member organization, they can see that Eben is a victim of identity fraud, and they would then go to extra lengths to ensure that they're dealing with the correct person, so you're not victimized again.
It's not only people that are, of course, targeted. There are also some desperate people that are being targeted by, I've read up about it, by crime syndicates who come into this sort of thing willingly and knowingly, and participate willingly and knowingly, especially young people who are unemployed and don't have much of an outlook. They're targeted by crime syndicates, and crime syndicates then get them to take out whatever amounts, also with fraudulent papers mostly. How do you combat that?
I think it comes down to education. A lot of people aren't aware of how precious your identity is. We equate it to money. If you had a wallet full of money, would you leave it lying around unattended? And that is essentially what we're trying to get the message out there. You need to be protective of your identity and think carefully before you make it available to other people. I think seeing that you mentioned young people, one of the things that people have got to be particularly careful of is what information they share over social networks and social media. Because your identity is out there. I was reading an article the other day where somebody said, for example, on Facebook, if all your friends should know your birthday and your date of birth and your address, why would you want to put it on Facebook? So it's little tips and tricks like that. I know we all like to get happy birthdays on our birthdays, but we've just got to think carefully about what information we're putting out there about ourselves.
Now, especially around financial institutions is where fraud happens. Where are some of the other areas where you can be sort of caught napping a little bit that people should be on the lookout for?
But I think we focus primarily on financial institutions, credit, things like cell phone companies and that sort of thing. But I think anywhere where your identity can be compromised and you become responsible for whatever transactions are entered with that. I think areas to look out specifically for is just the tricks that they use to get your identity is things like unsolicited SMSs or emails or the like. We must just be mindful. Don't unnecessarily share information that if you don't know where it's going to.
And do these people get hold of it? We hear about phishing networks and this sort of stuff where you can't really help yourself or you can't really protect yourself. Is there a lot of those kinds of scams out there?
But there is, and this is just what we're seeing going around now. There is an increase in phishing, certainly that we're aware of. And a lot of the time it is purportedly from a bank. So tax season's opened up at the beginning of July, so there are a lot of phishing emails and SMSs going around purportedly from the revenue services asking people to confirm information. Be very wary about that because the guys are sort of using tax season to lull people into that false sense of security as an example. A couple of tips to look out for there is you'll see there's normally an embedded link or a URL in there. Two things. You can either copy that, put it into your browser and actually try and access the website from there, or just by hovering your mouse cursor over that link, you can actually see what the actual URL is. And it might, for example, mention the organization that it's purportedly from in there, but there's a whole string of other information that should be cause a sense of worry.
Well, Roy, thank you very much for joining us. It's certainly very concerning that you could wake up one day and you could have a 2 million rand debt for a bond on a house that you don't know where it is.
Exactly.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us and pointing out, yes, up to R1 billion a year is what our economy loses due to ID fraud. There's lots of other instances of fraud that, of course, is not even within this calculation. But thanks, Operations Manager of the South African Fraud Prevention Service, Roy Retief, joining us live here in studio this morning to talk about ID fraud. It is a scourge. It's out there, and you have to protect yourself. Now, a person has been killed and 2 others injured during taxi violence at Sangweni taxi rank in Tembisa on the East Rand earlier this morning. Yeah, some of your views about what's been going on social media at SABC Newsroom, of course, is where we are. Nwabi says taxi drivers shooting each other at Sangweni taxi rank. Can't they find other ways to resolve their problems? Inconvenience to us now. No, there is no consideration for you, the client. Litle Kwinda says, my Tembisa people, what's happening at Sangweni taxi rank? Ramahuma Masesebi says, Sangweni taxi rank in sad story. Pikizolo says, Ikuruleni taxi violence in Tembisa at Sangweni taxi rank. Y'all stay clear if around. Multiple gunshots heard. Heavy police presence there. We'll give you more updates a little bit later in all our news bulletins on this very channel as to what is the latest there. Of course, all around the country there seems to be issues. But that's where we are wrapping it today. Newsroom broadcast live from our studios here in Auckland Park, Johannesburg, every weekday morning between 9 and 10 a.m. Don't forget, we also stream live on YouTube at this very time with the show available on demand on our YouTube channel. This is SABC News. You've been watching Newsroom. We love it in the morning.